Haddonfield, Illinois was carbon copy of every other quaint suburban town in the middle of nowhere, USA. And like every other quaint suburban town, we had our share of dirty secrets and dark stories that people wanted to keep hidden. Because if people knew about those dark stories, then they would know that everything was not right in our little world. And the most infamous story that people tried to keep buried was the murder of Judith Myers at the hands of her brother Michael in 1963. Growing up near the Myers house was pretty unsettling, and I remember riding my bike through the neighborhood, and I would try to avoid that block because everybody said the house was haunted. If the subject of the Myers family ever came up, you'd see people's faces change, you'd see their posture change, and you'd see that their minds were kind of racing to think of something else to talk about. And I think that's because, well, it's because they knew that he was really only a couple hours away at Smith's Grove. And I think that scared the shit out of them.
Michael Myers' life story plays out more like a horror movie than anything else. The fact that you have a 6-year-old boy dressing up for Halloween as a clown, and instead of going through his Halloween candy, he murders his older sister. I mean, Michael Myers never showed any sort of tendencies, any sort of psychotic tendencies whatsoever. And then, to top it all off, after murdering her, he goes into a self-induced catatonic state. All of these factors really attribute the public's interest in Michael Myers. I mean, you have a normal 6-year-old boy. One day he's climbing trees. He's riding his bicycle. Heck, he was probably afraid of the dark himself. And then the next day he's a psychotic murderer in an insane asylum? It really shakes the public up. I mean, it totally questions their preconceived notions about childhood innocence.
Michael never acted in a way that caused us to become concerned. He was never violent. He never lashed out. He was a good, normal, happy little boy. When I look at pictures of him, I still see that same little boy. The one that ran around in the backyard and up the stairs, smiling and laughing. I can still feel him hugging me. One night, Don and I went out with some friends, and when we came home, our daughter was dead, and her son had her blood on his hands. Everything we knew about him, everything we knew and loved was gone. We lost 2 children that night.
When we talk about child killers, nowadays we're desensitized to a lot of this murder and mass murder. We hear of these school shootings, but people are still shocked when we hear stories of these children that are serial killers and murderers. 2 cases that come to mind when I think of child murderers. One goes way back to 1874, and his name was Jesse Pomeroy. He was 12 years old when he tortured other little children in Boston. And Jesse Pomeroy eventually murdered 2 little children as well. One of them, he slashed the throat of this little boy at a beach, and then there was another girl that he murdered, and he sexually mutilated both of these victims. And another case that comes to mind is Mary Bell, and she was an 11-year-old girl who murdered 2 little boys in the UK. What's consistent with both of their cases is that they were both mentally and physically abused, to the extreme. And when I compare their cases to the case of Michael Myers, there's definitely a big difference, because Michael Myers had a relatively normal childhood. It would have been great if Michael would have opened up on his psychiatric studies and his interrogations and told us, more about his childhood and if there was any specific trauma that he suffered. But, unfortunately, we do not know exactly what happened.
There have been several films made about Michael Myers, but I don't think any of them have really captured the true depravity of what he is. The movies I've seen have tried to give him a different backstory than the one that really happened in real life. In a lot of the movies you've seen, he's from a white trash background. He's been emotionally and physically abused. His mother's a stripper, on and on. And his real background was anything from that.
When Dr. Loomis's notes were leaked to the public, by someone from Smith's Grove Sanitarium, no less, the public went wild. And there's a few reasons why this happened. First of all, Dr. Loomis's notes provided many more details about Judith Myers' murder than had ever been released before, so there's a lot of new data in there. The second thing about Dr. Loomis's notes is that he described Michael as someone with no remorse, no conscience. Basically, what he described Michael as is somebody who didn't understand right from wrong. When you read the notes, it didn't really sound like psychological analysis of a patient. Dr. Loomis's notes veered far off the subject. He actually sounded more like a man who was just fascinated with Michael Myers, but he was also scared to death of him.
Dr. Samuel Loomis was one of the most iconic of men. He was really a celebrity in the psychiatric community. After only a few short months of treating Michael Myers, he became really unrecognizable to his staff or colleagues at Smith's Grove, an entirely different person, because he was so obsessed with Michael. So much so that he got rid of his entire caseload solely to focus on Michael. Dr. Loomis didn't really think of Michael as a person. In fact, he referred to him as it whenever he did mention him. He didn't think that there was anything human about him. About the only resemblance would be the fact that he had flesh and he had blood, and that was it. He believed with every fiber of his being that Michael transcended anything that there was to being a human being.
The thing that cemented Michael Myers as the boogeyman in most people's minds is his murder spree after he escaped from Smith's Grove in 1978, October 30th. The ironic thing was that night, Dr. Loomis was there, and Michael Myers ended up stealing Dr. Loomis's car. As the car drove away, Dr. Loomis at Nurse Chambers remembered him saying, "The evil has gone." And I can't think of a more fitting description for what was heading toward Haddonfield that night.
When Michael Myers escaped from Smith's Grove Sanitarium, his very first victim was Christopher Hastings. This happened in Eureka, Illinois, as we all know. Christopher Hastings was a mechanic, and Michael Myers killed him with his bare hands. He actually twisted Christopher Hastings' head until his skull snapped from his spine. I mean, it was just brutal. It was horrific. Michael stole his work uniform and left his own hospital gown on Christopher Hastings' truck door, and then made his way onto Haddonfield, a short distance away.
Among Michael's victims that night were 3 teenagers: Annie Brackett, Linda Vanderklok, and Linda's boyfriend, Bob Sims. Lori Strode, one of the few survivors that night, said in her police statement that she saw Michael standing across the street staring at her when she was in class earlier that day, that he followed her and Annie and Linda home from school, and that she saw him standing in her backyard staring at her through her bedroom window.
Many serial killers have different motivations. H.H. Holmes's motivation was purely financial. Then you had Carl Panzram, who murdered his victims as revenge for how he was treated in prisons, how he was tortured in these awful prison conditions in the early 1900s. And then you have a case such as Michael Myers, who he obtained his pleasure from stalking his victims. It was like a hunter and prey, cat and mouse type of situation where he wanted his victims to know. He wanted to taunt them. He wanted them to know he was there. There were times that Lori said in a police report, Lori Strode specifically said in her police report that she had seen Michael Myers, staring at her at these different locations. And then she would look away and look back, and he would be disappeared into thin air, almost like a phantom.
Dr. Loomis wrote in a lot of his memoirs that Michael would just sit day after day in the sanitarium and he would stare at the wall, but he wasn't seeing the wall. He was looking forward to that day when he would escape and go back home and kill. A rage that intense doesn't just explode everywhere and hit people randomly. It's contained, it's suppressed until it is a single focused point that's going toward its target. And of course that target was a 17-year-old girl named Lori Strode. And so the obvious question becomes, why her? Why Lori? Why would he focus on a girl who was 2 years old at the time he was put in Smith's Grove? Lori Strode was the adopted daughter of Morgan and Pamela Strode. They adopted her in 1966 after her parents had been killed in a car accident. Morgan and Pamela changed her name to Lori, and after that was done, the Illinois Department of Child Services sealed her records and buried them. Why? Because they didn't want anyone, not even Lori herself, to know that her real parents were Donald and Edith Myers, and that her older brother was Michael Myers, and that he was the person who killed her older sister, Judith.
It was a Halloween like any other. I was dressed in a witch's costume that my mom had made for me, and I wore it to school. And then I went trick-or-treating with my friends right after school. And I wasn't allowed to go out at night. So I wasn't allowed to go out at night, so I knew that I was going to be with my babysitter, Annie. She was the sheriff's daughter, so my parents felt really safe leaving me with her. I knew that, let's be real, she wanted to be with her boyfriend that night, and so she kind of bribed me into not saying anything to my parents. And she said she would take me over to Tommy Doyle's house. And Tommy Doyle was the little boy I had a crush on at the time. And so she brought me over there where Lori was babysitting for him. And that was the last time I saw Annie.
Lori was convinced that her friends were playing a Halloween prank on her, so after she put Tommy Doyle and Lindsey Wallace to bed for the night, she decided to go across the street and catch them in the act. But when she got there, she was actually the one that was surprised. You see, Lori found her three friends murdered and displayed throughout the house. Linda Vanderklok was stuffed into a closet. Bob Sims was hung from a ceiling upside down, and Annie Brackett was laid across a bed with Judith Myers' headstone as the headboard. You can wonder why would Michael have done something like this, and the only thing I can reason is that he was playing a game with his sister Lori, the same way a lot of older brothers would play games with their younger sisters, and he wanted to play a game, and after that all that was left to do was to kill her.
I was lying in the bed in Tommy's bedroom, and he was of course asleep. I was wide awake because we just spent several hours watching horror movies, and I was in a strange bedroom, and I just was too afraid to close my eyes. And that's when I heard something crash. Something crashed against the house, and then the screaming started. And it wasn't like, you know, kids pulling a prank kind of screaming. It was blood curdling, I'm afraid for my life kind of screaming. And so I pushed Tommy to get out of the bed, and we went to the window, and it was Lori, and she was pounding on the front door, screaming for Tommy to let her in. And so he went down there, and I stayed at the window, and I could see her pounding on the door. And then out of the corner of my eye, I saw this movement, and it was Michael Myers. And he was walking across the street. He wasn't running, he was just walking. Like he knew that no matter what she did, he was gonna get her. And I just remember that face coming out of the shadows of the trees, and it was that pale face. And I'll never forget that. And then Tommy came running back upstairs, and he said that the boogeyman was out there. And I said, yeah, I saw him. I saw him.
The boogeyman is a universal archetype. It can be found in virtually every culture across the world, and it is one that is centuries old. And across the board, despite each culture's unique significance, the commonality of these boogeymen is that they are simply an embodiment of fear, with no discernible appearance or distinctive features. They have no definite shape. And in almost every version, the boogeyman is a character created by the elderly to frighten children in order to persuade them to do as they're told. For example, in Hispanic culture, you have the legend of El Cucuy, a mythical monster that kidnaps and eats children if they misbehave. Obviously, over the years, you learn to realize that these were just stories, and there really isn't any monsters hiding under your bed or in your closet. But in the case of Michael Myers, you have an actual physical being made of flesh and blood, yet driven by an unseen and supernatural force that makes him unstoppable. And although the mask that he wears is a common one that was stolen from a hardware store, on him, it takes on a much more diabolical significance. It is a total blank slate, emotionless and void of any color. So if the boogeyman is defined as this shapeless, faceless, evil entity that preys upon the weak, then, by that definition, Michael Myers is the real-life boogeyman.
I was just shaking uncontrollably. I was just shaking. And I was holding onto Tommy's hand. And we could hear Lori and Michael fighting downstairs. We heard that. And then it was suddenly silence. Just silence. And Lori came up to us. She came upstairs and opened the door. And we were in the hallway, and she said she had killed the boogeyman. She was hugging us, and I didn't want to let go of her. And then I saw him come up the stairs. I saw him. So Lori took us into Tommy's bedroom and she put us in the closet. And she told us to stay there. And we hid ourselves under clothes and coats. We just hid there. And Lori must have gone into Tommy's parents' bedroom. And that's where she and Michael. And Tommy and I we didn't know what to do with ourselves. We were there, we could hear them. And Tommy was just sort of rocking back and forth saying, oh, he's gonna get you, he's going to get you, he's gonna get you. Which didn't happen. And then there was silence again. And footsteps. And we didn't know if it was Lori or Michael coming towards our closet. But it was Lori. And she was so calm. She was so calm. And I think of her now as she must have been the strongest woman who ever lived, right? Because she was so calm. Even though her shirt was ripped and she was bloody. And she told us to run to the neighbors and call the police. And so we did. And I think back now, and I think we shouldn't have left her there. We shouldn't have left her behind.
Dr. Loomis was patrolling the neighborhood with the police when they heard the screaming of Tommy Doyle and Lindsey Wallace and saw them running across the street from the house. He went into the house to investigate and got there just in time to see Michael choking Lori. And she had managed somehow to pull the mask off his face, and while Michael was busy trying to pull the mask into place, that's when Dr. Loomis shot him 6 times. 6 times, propelling him off the balcony to the 2 stories below. And he looked down at Michael lying there and thought that he had put an end to this madness. He went inside, checked on Lori, found she was okay, and then when he came back out and looked down, all that was left was an imprint of Michael's body with the blood. And that was it. For the second time in 2 days, Michael Myers had escaped.
From that night on, Michael Myers has just been part of my life. My encounter with him was brief, but it might have been a lot different if it wasn't for Lori Strode. After that, my parents moved us out of Haddonfield. It was like a few months later, and the whole town had changed. And I think about all those stories that we made up as kids, freak each other out about Michael Myers. And what actually happened was so much worse than anything we ever. I think about all those fears and all the dark stories that the adults in Haddonfield tried to keep hidden. All that came right back to him. Halloween night in 1978, the night he came home.
Bum 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 bum. Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. Make him the cutest that I've ever seen. Give him 2 lips like roses and clover. Then tell him that his lonesome nights are over. Sandman, I'm so alone. Don't have nobody to call my own. Please turn on your magic beam, Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. Bum 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 bum. Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. Make him the cutest that I've ever seen. Give him the word that I'm not a rover. Then tell him that his lonesome nights are over. Sandman, I'm so alone. Don't have nobody to call my own. Please turn on your magic beam, Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. Bum 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 bum. Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. Give him a pair of eyes with a come-hither gleam. Give him a lonely heart like Pagliacci, and lots of wavy hair like Liberace. Sandman, someone to hold would be so peachy before I'm too old. Please turn on your magic beam, Mr. Sandman, bring me, please, please bring me, Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream.
Cruising ahead, man, that's some nasty shit, dude. Man, I mean, it's just, it deforms, man. It completely deforms the flesh. That's fucking amazing.